On the 9th of August 1945, a US B-29 bomber named Boxcar dropped an atomic bomb which exploded over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. That bomb was powered by an unimaginable destructive power unleashed by the nuclear fission of plutonium atoms. It was codenamed Fat Man. In the fireball and shockwave triggered by that brutal weapon, 70,000 Japanese civilians were killed, maimed or blinded. In the days, weeks and years which followed, thousands more died from radiation poisoning.
This is the harrowing saga of the events leading up to the fateful decision to unleash the second atomic bomb, which was detonated over the Japanese city of Nagasaki on 9th of August 1945. That tragic event took place only 3 days after the first atomic bomb had been detonated over Hiroshima. The Chief of Staff of the US Army had initially prepared for atomic bombs to be used on 4 Japanese cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata and Kyoto. On 25th of July 1945, Nagasaki was substituted for Kyoto. Kyoto had been spared, but only at the expense of Nagasaki.
Immediately following the bombing of Hiroshima, the President of the United States delivered an ultimatum to the Japanese government.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
Surrender or face complete destruction. The ultimatum was ignored.
The sad fact is that on the 9th of August 1945, Nagasaki was not even the primary target. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki had actually been intended for the city of Kokura. As Kokura was obscured by smoke from earlier raids, Boxcar switched to its secondary target, Nagasaki. The melancholy fact is the nuclear attack on Nagasaki need never have happened. The use of the atom bomb could and should have been averted.
At 10:58 the morning of August 9th, Japanese time, the second atomic bomb was exploded over the industrial seaport city of Nagasaki. Almost the entire population of 230,000 people was engaged in the manufacture of arms, munitions, and other war products. Two great Mitsubishi factories were located in the heart of the city. To the north, one of the world's largest torpedo plants, and further south, the huge steel and arms works. The bomb, which was dropped on Nagasaki, was aimed at a point midway between the two plants in order to cause the greatest possible industrial damage. Unlike Hiroshima, the force of the explosion at Nagasaki was largely confined to the industrial valley, which was surrounded by a series of hills that shielded many other areas of the city. A great towering mushroom effect could be seen going higher and higher and reaching into the stratosphere. Because the bomb was exploded high above the ground, the greatest part of its harmful radioactive material was dissipated in the stratosphere. As a result, the area under the explosion was relatively free from radioactivity. Persons entering Nagasaki shortly after the explosion to do rescue work sustained no ill effect or injury.
The heartbreaking fact is that the detonation of the atom bomb over Hiroshima 3 days earlier on 6th of August 1945 constituted an undisputable demonstration that the time had come for Japan's immediate surrender. The evidence from Hiroshima was powerful and conclusive. There was therefore no need for any further proof. The detonation over Nagasaki of the second atomic bomb 3 days later ought therefore to have been avoided. Yosuke Yamahata photographed this child incinerated in Nagasaki. American forces censored such images in Japan until 1952.
In an area of a little more than 3 square miles, there was very severe damage by blast and fire. Most buildings were reduced to rubble. Still recognizable from the air are the skeleton remainders of the Mitsubishi plants, the large steel and arms works, and the ordnance factory devoted to the manufacture of torpedoes. Mitsubishi Steel and Arms Works extended almost a mile in length. Its buildings were modern and typical of American industrial construction, having steel frames and roof and siding of corrugated metal or asbestos. Buildings of reinforced concrete still stand amid the wreckage of steel frames. Some smokestacks survived. They offered comparatively little resistance to the blast. But as in Hiroshima, the directional force bent steel and stripped corrugated metal from the framework of the building. Where corrugated metal remained, it was pushed in like tissue paper. These buildings show a varying degree of destruction depending upon proximity to 0 point and building strength. This foundry, 3/10 of a mile away from 0 point, shows considerable damage in spite of fairly good construction. Other buildings were strong, some being constructed to support heavy overhead cranes. Damage to equipment inside was nevertheless serious. This machinery had been used in the manufacture of naval rifles, anti-aircraft guns, and heavy artillery. In the valley, homes were scattered through factory areas. On machinery in many of these homes, piecework was carried on to help the Japanese war effort. Blast and secondary fire destroyed the lightly constructed buildings, in many cases leaving damaged equipment. Photographed from 0 point, this area of 3 1/10 square miles shows almost utter devastation by blast and fire. Note how hills in the south interrupted the blast. In the second area of 5 1/2 square miles, there was moderate damage from blast and severe damage from fires. The total area of damage covered almost 42 1/2 square miles, ranging from complete destruction to damaged roofs and broken windows. The greatest distance at which damage was measured was 12 miles, where, through a peculiar focusing of concussion, workers' barracks were knocked down. 1/2 mile from 0 point, a cracked smokestack. A prison of concrete and masonry 2/10 of a mile from 0 point was almost totally destroyed. The walls left standing were parallel to the direction of the blast. This area was completely wiped out from 0 point up to the church at the foot of the hills about a mile away. In the bed of the creek rests the dome, which was blown from its place at the top of the church. The gasworks was blown into a mass of twisted steel. 2 concrete walls, the remains of 2 factory buildings. Bridges showed greater destruction in Nagasaki than in Hiroshima. But even close to 0 point, the downward force of the blast failed to damage roads and railroads due to the height at which the bomb was detonated. The main north-south street of Nagasaki was in use shortly after the disaster occurred.
However, as you're about to discover, due to a combination of unfortunate weather events, political procrastination by Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War, and the fanatical Japanese mindset, the dismal fact remains: it took the detonation of a second atom bomb to finally force Japan into surrender.
In March 1945, the tides of war were turning against Japan. Nonetheless, Japanese forces continued to stubbornly resist Allied forces in Burma, China, and the Pacific. In every theatre of war, Allied casualties were enormous. The successful invasion of the Japanese island of Okinawa, which began on the 1st of April 1945, served a salutary warning to the US High Command.
Building on all of the painful lessons learned from the invasion of Okinawa, Operation Downfall was the code name for the planned Allied invasion of Japan, which was intended to bring about the end of the war in 1946.
However, on the 16th of July 1945, a radical solution was presented to the Allied commanders. The first nuclear bomb was successfully tested 200 miles south of Los Alamos. Thanks to the famous Manhattan Project, America had won the race to generate enough uranium-235 to power an atom bomb.
Three different cameras recorded from 6 miles away these views of the most concentrated release of explosive energy in the history of mankind. "21 days after the New Mexico experiment, a V-29 was over Hiroshima carrying an atomic bomb. At 8:15 in the morning of August 6th, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb struck an enemy target. This is 0 point on Hiroshima, the exact spot above the city at which the bomb burst over enemy territory, at the junction of the Matoyusu and Oto rivers. The atomic bomb was intentionally exploded well above its target in order to dissipate its radioactive material.
It's essential to realise that by 1939, the principles of nuclear fission were not a secret. They were well known and understood by scientists around the globe. The discovery of nuclear fission by German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann in 1938 meant the development of an atomic bomb was now a very real prospect. In consequence, Britain, the USA, Germany, and Japan all began work on research programs to develop the atomic bomb.
From the time of that first explosion until Hiroshima shuddered beneath the release of atomic energy, work on the bomb went steadily forward in closely guarded plants in New Mexico, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington.
In 1941, Yoshio Nishina, a leading nuclear scientist, was commissioned by the Japanese Army to develop an atomic weapon. This project was codenamed NIGO. From 1941 onwards, Nishina was on the path which, given time and a sufficient supply of uranium, would ultimately have produced a Japanese atom bomb. In 1942, the Technical Research Institute of the Imperial Japanese Navy, headed by Captain Yoji Ito, concluded that the US was certainly working on an atomic bomb. In 1942, therefore, the Japanese Navy commenced a rival atomic bomb development project codenamed FGO. This project was under the direction of Bunsaku Arakatsu, a physics professor at Kyoto Imperial University. Arakatsu had studied in Berlin under Albert Einstein. Also involved in the Japanese Navy's FGO nuclear weapons research was Hideki Yukawa, who in 1949 was to become Japan's first Nobel laureate in physics. However, the major obstacle for both NIGO and FGO was uranium procurement. Teams of Japanese scientists were sent to scour various parts of Asia, even as far as Mongolia and Burma, but none of them could acquire the requisite supplies of uranium ore. The successful test of an atomic bomb took place on the Alamogordo bombing range in the inhospitable desert area known as Jornada del Muerto, or Dead Man's Trail. During the Second World War, producing sufficient plutonium and uranium-235 to power 3 atomic bombs was the major achievement of the highly secretive Manhattan Project. Unbeknown to the Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of War, the Manhattan Project, in addition to producing enough uranium-235 to power an atom bomb, codenamed Little Boy, they had also mastered the process of producing enough plutonium to power 3 additional nuclear bombs of the type codenamed Fat Man. The Chief of Staff of the US Army immediately prepared for atomic bombs to be used on 4 Japanese cities: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. The first of the Fat Man type plutonium bombs was used in the Trinity nuclear test in July 1945. The second was to be detonated over Nagasaki on 9th of August 1945.
In the face of the certain prospect of hundreds of thousands of American casualties, which would be incurred in the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, events moved at lightning speed. The 509th Composite Group of the U.S. Army Air Forces was trained and equipped with the specialized silver plate version of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress and deployed to Tinian in the Mariana Islands.
1944, high over the Pacific Ocean. A fleet of the mightiest super bombers in the world were completing a 5,000-mile flight from San Francisco to Saipan. Less than 4 months before, the island was in Japanese hands. It was for bases like these that American soldiers, sailors, and Marines had fought the costly battle. On Columbus Day 1944, B-29s discovered Saipan.
Our arrival was a real historic event, celebrated with a ballad by a local poet, and it went like this. On the 12th of October back in 1944, the citizens of Saipan heard a great four-engine roar. Bulldozers split the runway. The soldiers stopped to cheer as down came Jolton Josie, the Pacific pioneer. It was a great day for the aviation engineers and service groups who had hacked the airfield out of jungle. To them, Jolton Josie was a sensation who shamelessly stole the show. Some Jap officials already knew that Saipan, as an American base, with its threat of aerial bombardment, spelled eventual defeat for Japan. The landing of the B-29s gave reality to that threat. The new arrivals were men who had flown fortresses and liberators in all theaters of war. They were led by a former 1928 flying cadet, who in 1944 was named Deputy Chief of Air Staff and was now commanding the 21st Bomber Command, General Haywood Hansel.
Well, the first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
All over the Marianas, B-29s were getting ready to carry out the General's promise.
On the day of the bombing, an estimated 263,000 people were in Nagasaki, including 240,000 Japanese residents, 10,000 Korean residents, 2,500 conscripted Korean workers, 9,000 Japanese soldiers, 600 conscripted Chinese workers, and 400 Allied prisoners of war who were held in a camp to the north of Nagasaki.
However, there should have been one last attempt to warn the citizens of Nagasaki of their impending fate. Millions of leaflets warning of an impending attack on the city were to be dropped on Nagasaki.
To the Japanese people, America asks that you take immediate heed of what we say on this leaflet. We are in possession of the most destructive explosive ever devised by man. A single one of our newly developed atomic bombs is actually the equivalent in explosive power to what 2,000 of our giant B-29s can carry on a single mission. This awful fact is one for you to ponder, and we solemnly assure you it is grimly accurate. We have employed our atomic bomb. A single one of our newly developed atomic bombs is actually the equivalent in explosive power to what 2,000 of our giant B-29s could have carried on a single mission. Radio Tokyo has told you that with the first use of this weapon of total destruction, Hiroshima was virtually destroyed. Before we use this bomb again and again to destroy every resource of the military by which they are prolonging this useless war, petition the Emperor now to end the war.
By rejecting the idea of unconditional surrender, the Japanese High Command had made a fatal error, which was to cost the lives of 100,000 civilians. The important factor, and that of overriding importance, was the fact that by July 1945, the Manhattan Project had actually succeeded in producing not just one, but two types of atomic bomb. Little Boy, which was exploded above Hiroshima on 6th of August 1945, was the world's one and only atomic bomb powered by enriched uranium. However, unknown to the Japanese Supreme Council for the Direction of War was the fact that also in readiness was the Fat Man, a plutonium implosion type nuclear weapon. It was this type of atom bomb which had been tested by a controlled ground-based explosion 210 miles south of Los Alamos on 16th of July. The two atom bombs which are ready to be dropped from aircraft over Japan were the very first of their kind. They were in effect experimental weapons, and there was no guarantee that the bombs dropped from an aircraft as opposed to a controlled ground explosion would even work. It's vitally important to realise the uranium-235 atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the first time such a weapon had been dropped from an aircraft with a time-delayed fuse. There had been no rehearsal. There was only enough uranium-235 for one bomb of the Little Boy type. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was the one and only uranium-powered bomb in the world. This immensely scarce resource was only produced in tiny quantities, and there had been no possibility, therefore, of a test. However, American officials correctly surmised that it would be necessary to drop more than one atom bomb. They appropriately forecast that the Japanese hardliners would minimise the effect of the first explosion and might attempt to explain it away as some sort of abnormal catastrophe. This is precisely what Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War in fact did. In the days following the bombing of Hiroshima, despite all the evidence to the contrary, the Japanese Minister of War refused to even admit that the Hiroshima bomb was indeed an atomic bomb.
In early May 1945, the Interim Committee was created by Stimson at the urging of the leaders of the Manhattan Project and with the approval of Truman, to advise on matters pertaining to nuclear technology. They agreed that the atomic bomb was to be used against Japan at the earliest opportunity, without special warning and on a dual target of military installations surrounded by other buildings susceptible to damage. During the meetings on the 31st of May and the 1st of June, scientist Ernest Lawrence had suggested giving the Japanese a non-combat demonstration.
Though the possibility of a demonstration that would not destroy human lives was attractive, no one could suggest a way in which it could be made so convincing that it would be likely to stop the war. It was evident that everyone would suspect trickery. If a bomb were exploded in Japan with previous notice, the Japanese air power was still adequate to give serious interference. An atomic bomb was an intricate device, still in the developmental stage. Its operation would be far from routine. If during the final adjustments of the bomb, the Japanese defenders should attack, a faulty move might easily result in some kind of failure. Such an end to an advertised demonstration of power would be much worse than if the attempt had not been made.
Many US officials and scientists argued that a demonstration would sacrifice the shock value of the atomic attack, and the Japanese could deny the atomic bomb was lethal, making the mission less likely to produce surrender. Allied prisoners of war might be moved to the demonstration site and be killed by the bomb. They also worry that the bomb might be a failure, as the Trinity test was that of a stationary device, not an airdropped bomb. The United States detonated the first atomic bomb. The target was the city of Hiroshima. In order to maximize the destructive power of the blast, the bomb was detonated 600 yards above the doomed city. The terrifying suffering unleashed by the atom bomb was far beyond anything experienced by the stoic Japanese population, which was already enduring horrific firebombing of Japanese cities, which had ravaged the Japanese home islands. On the 7th of August, a day after Hiroshima was destroyed, Yoshio Nishina, at the head of Project Nigu, Japan's equivalent of the Manhattan Project, arrived at the city. He was met with a nightmarish scene of utter devastation. Nishina returned to Tokyo and told the cabinet that Hiroshima had been destroyed by a nuclear weapon. However, on the advice of Nishina, Admiral Toyoda, the chief of the Naval General Staff, correctly concluded that the extreme difficulty posed by creating enough fissionable uranium-235 meant that, in his estimation, only one additional atomic bomb could exist at that point in time. In the light of this knowledge, Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War took the crass decision to continue the war.
However, in order to give time for the seriousness of the situation to sink in on Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War, the Allies decided to delay the dropping of a second atomic bomb until 11th of August 1945. The primary target was Kokura and the secondary target was Nagasaki. However, and this is the tragic thing, the weather forecast intervened. Despite the almost certain knowledge that Japan would have to endure further nuclear attacks, astonishingly, Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of War decided the war would go on, with the accompanying loss of life and the unimaginable volume of the most appalling suffering. American magic code breakers intercepted the Japanese cabinet's messages, and the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th was the dreadful result. The important fact is that there was sufficient plutonium for 3 further plutonium-powered atomic bombs. However, there was no guarantee that a plutonium bomb released by the untested method of being dropped from an aircraft for the first time ever would not prove to be a dud. It was vital, therefore, to use the bomb when the weather conditions were perfect. To compound matters, a period of 5 days of bad weather was forecast for 11th of August 1945. It was therefore decided that the detonation of the second atomic bomb would be brought forward by 2 days to 9th of August 1945.
At 3:47 a.m. on the morning of the 9th of August, 1945, Boxcar and the Great Artiste lifted off from Tinian Island. The atomic bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was aboard Boxcar. The bomb was already armed, but the electrical safety plugs were still engaged. Kokura was the primary target, and Nagasaki the secondary target. However, during pre-flight inspection of Boxcar, the flight engineer notified his pilot, Major Charles Sweeney, that an inoperative fuel transfer pump made it impossible to use 640 gallons of fuel carried in a reserve tank. Replacing the pump would take hours. The delicate task of moving the Fat Man to another aircraft would take just as long and was extremely dangerous as well. The bomb was new and unfamiliar technology. It was live and could not be trusted not to detonate if a wrong move was made. Major Sweeney therefore decided that there was no option. The extra fuel would have to be carried all the way to Japan and back. With this added dead weight consuming still more fuel, Boxcar set off on her famous mission and proceeded to the primary target, the city of Kokura.
There were 3 bombing runs over Kokura. However, on arrival over Kokura, the city was obscured by clouds and drifting smoke from fires started by a major firebombing raid by 224 B-29s on nearby Yahata the previous day. Additionally, the Yahata steelworks intentionally burned coal tar to produce black smoke. The clouds and smoke resulted in the aiming point over Kokura being totally obscured. Nonetheless, 3 abortive bomb runs were made over the next 50 minutes, burning fuel and exposing the aircraft repeatedly to the heavy defences around Kokura. Each time, Captain Kermit Behan, the bombardier, was unable to drop the bomb, as in all the smoke and cloud cover, he could not visually identify the target. By the time of the 3rd bomb run, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was getting close, and Second Lieutenant Jacob Besser, who was monitoring Japanese communications, reported activity on the Japanese fighter direction radio broadcasts. The target was therefore switched to Nagasaki. With fuel running low because of the failed fuel pump, Boxcar, accompanied by the Great Artiste, headed for the secondary target of Nagasaki. The unsuspecting inhabitants of the city of Nagasaki now had one very last chance at salvation. Aboard Boxcar, the decision had been taken that, if on their arrival the city of Nagasaki was obscured by cloud cover, the crew would carry the bomb back to Okinawa and dispose of it in the ocean.
At 7:50 a.m. on the morning of 11th August, 1945, an air raid alert was sounded in Nagasaki, but the all-clear signal was given at 8:30 a.m. The Fat Man weapon, containing a core of about 11 pounds of plutonium, was hastily dropped over the city's industrial valley, and Boxcar immediately turned 60 degrees and headed for home.
Fat Man exploded 47 seconds later at 11:02, some 500 yards above a tennis court. Fortunately for many thousands of Japanese citizens who were destined to survive that fateful day, this spot was nearly 2 miles northwest of the planned hypocenter. The blast was therefore confined to the Urakami Valley. Although the bomb was more powerful than the one used on Hiroshima, its effects were confined by the hillsides to the narrow Urakami Valley. The major portion of the city was therefore protected by the intervening hills. Nonetheless, the death toll from the bomb drop over Nagasaki amounted to 100,000 by the end of 1945. However, a tiny crumb of consolation came from the knowledge that had the bomb been dropped more precisely at the intended aiming point, which was the heart of the historic district, the destruction and the corresponding death toll would have been far greater. Nevertheless, of 7,500 Japanese employees who worked inside the Mitsubishi munitions plant, 6,200 were killed. Some 22,000 other workers also died in other war plants and factories in the city. In addition to the horrifying effects of the bomb, the explosion also generated a windstorm several kilometers wide that carried ash, dust and debris over the mountain ranges surrounding Nagasaki. Approximately 20 minutes after the bombing, and for 2 hours solid, a black rain with the consistency of mud or oil came down, carrying deadly radioactive material.
Over the next 6 months, the effects of the atomic bombs killed an estimated 250,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Roughly half occurred on the first day. For months afterwards, many people continued to die from the effects of burns, radiation sickness, and other injuries, compounded by illness and malnutrition. Despite Hiroshima's sizable military garrison, estimated at 24,000 troops, some 90% of the dead were civilians.
Fortunately, on 10th of August, the Emperor finally gave his sacred decision authorizing Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo to notify the Allies that Japan would accept the terms on one condition, that the declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. On August 19th, 1945, a US Army film crew recorded the arrival of the Japanese peace envoys. They arrived on Iwo on white-painted Mitsubishi G4M bombers. The Japanese war party had finally been defeated. The dream of a Japanese empire was now at an end. More importantly, the nightmare of 15 years of war in China, Asia, and the Pacific was over at last.
Scholars have extensively studied the effects of the bombings on the social and political character of subsequent world history and popular culture. There is still much debate concerning the ethical and legal justification for the bombings. According to supporters, the atomic bombings were necessary to bring an end to the war with minimal casualties and ultimately prevented a greater loss of life on both sides. According to the critics, the bombings were unnecessary for the war's end and were a war crime, raising moral and ethical implications.
It's a debate which will never be resolved. There are those who cogently argue that the atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were violations of the laws and customs of war because the attacks did not distinguish between military and civilian targets and inflicted unnecessary suffering by the deliberate bombing of civilians. This constituted a war crime. However, their opponents point to the fact that the Japanese government had promulgated a national mobilization law and were waging total war, which compelled all civilians, including women and children and old people, to work in factories and other infrastructure attached to the war effort, and to fight to the death against any invading force. There is also the question of why the dropping of the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki came only 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima. The lack of time between the bombings has led some historians to state that the second bombing was certainly unnecessary, gratuitous at best, and genocidal at worst. However, this argument relies entirely on the benefit of hindsight. The importance of the fact that during the Second World War, Japan had its own atomic bomb development programs cannot be underestimated. In retrospect, we know the Japanese NEGO project was unsuccessful, but in 1945 there was no way of knowing that.